It was 1874 when the landscape stretched out hard and unforgiving, under a winter sky drained of color. Dead grass stood stiff and golden, clicking together in the bitter wind like fragments of the past that wouldn't fade. The sun hung low on the horizon, throwing elongated shadows from the cottonwood trees, clinging to what was left of the riverbed. Beneath one of those trees, Elias Boone pulled his mule to a stop and saw them. 5 human shapes clustered together like rocks, bracing themselves against the elements. Against the tree trunk leaned a woman, her hair wild and unkempt, her dress ripped and covered in layers of dirt. Fever glistened on her skin, and her mouth hung slightly open, as if every breath required a conscious decision. Surrounding her were 4 children, clinging like young trees around an ancient one that's fading. Their faces showed the hollowness of hunger, their cheeks marked with filth, their eyes holding that peculiar blend of starvation and desperate optimism that belongs only to those the world has abandoned. A small girl, barely 4 years old, lifted her gaze toward him with quivering lips. Her tiny voice, nearly swallowed by the wind, spoke words sharper than steel. "Are you here to hurt our mama too? She's dying?" Elias gave no response. He climbed down carefully, his boots breaking through the frost with each step, his heavy wool coat dragging against the brittle vegetation. His unkempt dark hair, neglected for weeks, hung across his forehead. The rifle strapped to his back caught the dim light. The children recoiled momentarily, bracing for yet another cruel blow from the world. Elias lowered himself and laid the rifle in the dirt. He removed a satchel and set before them a piece of bread, some dried meat, and a water flask. The children stared, unable to process such an offering. The oldest boy, maybe 9 years old, paused before drawing his siblings nearer. Distrust marked his weathered young face. But starvation overpowered caution. He broke off a small portion of bread, offering it first to his mother, who attempted to refuse. Then to his younger sister. Elias observed without speaking, his expression impossible to read, but unwavering. Each action measured as if the smallest gesture could reshape destiny. Clara May Hollander her name, though Elias hadn't learned it, yet opened her eyes slightly. The irises dulled by illness. Embarrassment crossed her features when she noticed the stranger observing her. She attempted to stand, to form words of apology for simply existing, but her body wouldn't cooperate. She collapsed back against the trunk, breathing shallowly, her pride as damaged as her clothing. Without a word, Elias lifted her. His arms were powerful yet gentle, as if she weighed no more than the ghosts of his own sorrow. He positioned her across the mule's back, then wrapped his coat around her. The children, confused but frantic, held each other tight and trailed behind as he guided them from the withering tree. He walked alongside the mule rather than riding, each footfall in his boots marking a promise he couldn't articulate. The path to his cabin twisted through tight valleys and over iced-over streams. The smallest girl tripped frequently, but Elias would stop, wait, and offer his hand for balance. He never uttered a sound. His quietness wasn't callousness, but something heavier like the stillness before snowfall. A quietness that could either comfort or overwhelm. When the smoke from his chimney appeared against the skyline, dusk had painted the sky in bruised purples and grays. His cabin sat isolated at the forest's edge, a weathered structure built from logs darkened by time and storms. The children hesitated at the entrance, unsure whether this place meant safety or danger. Elias pushed the door open, the hinges moaning like an elderly voice, and guided them through. Inside smelled of burning wood and cooked beans. Flames danced in the fireplace, casting warm light across patched blankets and shelves lined with equipment. It wasn't luxurious, but against the brutal winter outside, it was rescue. He placed Clara on his bed, its rough coverings aged but clean, and brought a bowl of water. With hands marked by years of labor and hunting, he tended her injury scratches on her arms, a hidden cut near her scalp. His movements were confident, though his expression stayed cloaked in shadow. The children consumed the beans he provided, and found corners of the cabin to curl up in, their stomachs finally quiet. The oldest boy remained alert, suspicious eyes, tracking Elias's every movement, but exhaustion eventually claimed even him. Only Clara shifted occasionally. her lips forming fragmented whispers of prayer or contrition. When the fever intensified, perspiration collecting at her temples, she tried rising again. "We'll leave," she breathed. "We won't burden you further." Her voice was faint, but the shame within it hit harder than the actual words. Elias shook his head, once simple and absolute, then built up the fire. He placed a cool cloth on her forehead, his silence speaking louder than any refusal. Clara turned away, tears streaming down her face, ashamed that compassion still existed in a world where she felt undeserving of it. Night deepened. Beyond the walls, coyotes called across the plains, their lonely songs threading through gaps in the cabin structure. Elias sat near the fire, rifle resting on his knees, staring into the flames. Sleep wouldn't come. It couldn't. Whenever Clara stirred, he leaned closer, monitoring the fragile rhythm of her breathing. Inside his chest, a memory blazed of another woman, another bed, another fever he'd been powerless to stop. He'd buried language with her years ago, vowed never to speak of affection again. Yet here lay a widow with her children, pulled from death's edge by nothing more than circumstance and his hesitant compassion. Near midnight, Clara's fever peaked. She cried out her children's names, her voice fragmenting into sobs, though her eyes remained closed. Thomas, Samuel, Maggie. And her fingers gripped the blanket as if she were already slipping away from them. Elias stood, moved to her side, and grasped her hand. His palm was coarse, her skin burning against it. He lowered his head, pressed his lips together, and for the first time in years he prayed. The prayer had no words, just a low rumble in the cabin's stillness, a desperate plea carved from the bedrock of his soul. He prayed she'd live to see morning, that her children wouldn't wake orphaned, that his hands might hold something besides grief. The fire crackled, shadows danced on the walls, and for one suspended moment, time itself seemed to pause. When the fever finally broke, her breathing settled into a shallow but steady pattern. Elias didn't let go of her hand. He remained there. In the firelight, the children sleeping around them, the cabin enveloped in survival's quiet embrace. His silence was no longer hollow. It had become a vow, though unspoken. Still, as the coals dimmed and the coyotes quieted, he understood the battle was nowhere near finished. The widow remained as delicate as a flickering flame, her children thin and exhausted, their faith as breakable as ice. Outside, the town's condemnation lurked like darkness at every light's edge. He could sustain them through the night. Maybe through the coming days, but the world outside wasn't so easily controlled. Elias gazed into the blackness beyond the window. His hands still wrapped around hers, and felt the awakening of something long dormant in ache that might eventually be named either love or destruction. Dawn light crept through cracks in the cabin walls, spreading soft gold across the worn floorboards. Clara woke, her fever gone, her breathing more regular.
Ah!
The blanket carried scents of smoke and pine of survival itself, linked slowly. Adjusting to the glow, and spotted Elias outside through the small window. He was chopping wood, his coat discarded, his broad shoulders moving rhythmically. Each axe strike resonating like the mountain's pulse. Round his feet her children collected kindling, their laughter delicate but genuine, shocking against the silence that had brought them here. She pressed her hand to her chest, as if to preserve that sound forever. For the first time in months, hunger hadn't woken the children crying. They were fed, playing, even smiling, their faces showing the faintest hint of wellness. And this stranger who'd barely spoken was the source of it all. Shame and thankfulness. Warred inside her two forces tugging at the same fragile soul. When Elias came back carrying fresh wood, Clara forced herself upright. Her body resisted, but her pride insisted. She straightened her torn dress and spoke quietly. "I won't be a weight on you." Her voice trembled, not from illness, but from memories of doors shut in her face. A family who declared that a woman with children but no husband had no place under their roofs. Elias set down the wood and looked at her directly. He said nothing. He simply poured water into a tin cup and offered it. His silence wasn't rejection or acceptance, it was something else, a steadiness that made her shame waver. She accepted. The cup, their fingers briefly touching, and though neither moved further, The space between them grew dense with unspoken commitments. Days passed with peaceful regularity. Elias hunted game, providing meat with a hunter's skill. He repaired Clara's worn shoes using leather scraps, the stitching rough but durable. He whittled a wooden horse for Maggie, whose tiny hands gripped it like a precious gem. He taught Thomas how to chop kindling, guiding the boy's hands with his weathered ones. Samuel, timid and slight, he hoisted onto his shoulders to reach high pine cones, the boy's giggles echoing through the clearing. Ani the baby trailed, him everywhere, pulling at his coat and beaming when he paused to touch her hair. Clara observed all this with a trembling heart. She mended clothes by the fire, her needle awkward initially, then more certain as her hands recalled what it meant to create rather than plead. She began sweeping floors, washing dishes, transforming their desperate existence into something like a home. Though she moved cautiously, her body still weak, her spirit started rising. The shame that had bent her shoulders began loosening strand by strand. But the outside world couldn't be avoided forever. Supplies ran low, and Elias knew they must visit town. Clara feared it more than starvation. Town had rejected her before, labeling her husbandless, powerless, worthless. Still, she fastened her faded dress, tied her hair with her hidden ribbon, and walked alongside Elias with her children. The town froze when they arrived. Whispers spread like dust kicked up by wind. That's her Hollander's widow, staying in Boone's cabin, nothing more than common disgrace. Faces turned, eyes squinted, mouths curled. Clara's hands trembled, but Elias walked beside her, towering and unmovable, his long coat sweeping the ground. His hand rested gently on Annie's shoulder, solid as bedrock. That single gesture silenced more critics than any speech could. At the general store, Clara kept her eyes down. She exchanged a bundle of repaired fabric for flour and salt, each coin, placed with deliberate care, her pride painstakingly reconstructed with shaking hands. Elias remained silent, just lifted the heavy bag and led them away. But the town's judgment clung like lingering smoke, a reminder that mere survival meant nothing when dignity had been torn away. Back at the cabin, Clara's tears finally spilled. She apologized for pulling Elias into her shame. But Elias, kneeling by the fire, placed a small object in her lap, a carved comb made of cedar, simple but smooth, carrying the faint scent of forest. Her breath stopped. She touched the comb, her fingers following its lines, then lifted her gaze. Elias met her eyes, his look steady, holding no shame. In that quietness, she sensed something beyond pity, respect, and perhaps something deeper. She tied her hair with her worn ribbon, and when she glanced across the fire, Ilias's eyes remained on her. Days stretched longer, spring threatening winter's hold. The cabin filled with sounds, the fire's crackle, the scrape of Elias's carving knife, Clara's soft humming while sewing. Every evening they shared food. Every morning work. What had started as basic survival transformed into true belonging, but external pressure intensified. Men from town arrived one evening, their laughter harsh, their words vicious. "Boone, you're throwing yourself away on her. She's damaged goods. Better send her back where you found her," their mockery targeted. Clara, who stood in the doorway, her face drained of color, but her chin raised. Elias said nothing. He stood tall, eyes cold, shoulders set, his silence more powerful than storms. The men departed unnerved, but their sting lingered. Clara's dignity teetered on the brink of shattering again. The following morning, Elias saddled the mule and rode with Clara and the children to the small church perched on the hill beyond town. The pews buzzed with whispers as they entered. The preacher looked startled, then composed himself. Clara's hands shook. Her children pressed tight against her, but Elias stepped forward. His voice, so long unused, carried like stones scraping across stone. "This woman is mine, and I am hers. I will not speak against her again." The church fell silent. Clara's tears fell freely, but she didn't lower her head. She stood taller, as if his words had sewn her spirit back together. The children clutched. Her skirts, wide-eyed, sensing something monumental taking form. The preacher cleared his throat, opened his book, and recited the ceremony. There were no rings, no fine clothing, but dignity wrapped them more completely than expensive fabric. When the vows concluded, Elias took her hand. He didn't kiss it or press it to his heart. He simply held it, his silence brimming with pride. Clara looked at him and understood that she was no longer a burden, no longer cast out. She was his wife, and her children would flourish under the protection of his name. That evening, back at the cabin, the fire glowed warmly. The children slept in a heap, Maggie clutching her wooden horse, Annie with her thumb tucked beneath her chin. Clara sat, brushing her hair with the comb, ribbon tied with thoughtful care. Elias sat opposite her, watching the weight of his silence mellowing now into something approaching tranquility. For the first time in years, Clara felt her lungs expand completely, her shame lifted, her heart calm. She looked at Elias, at the man who had chosen quietness over declarations, and understood that in his silence she'd discovered the most genuine promise of all. And outside, the mountains rose eternal, guarding their secret, as if declaring that love wasn't always thunderous. Sometimes it was food left beside a dying tree. Sometimes it was a man's unwavering presence facing society's scorn. And sometimes it was the quiet dignity of two wounded souls, now standing complete once more.